Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 6. What we're going to be looking at now is some of the physiology of bone, actually get into some of the concepts. First thing we're going to be talking about is ossification, and that's a process of making bone. So we're going to catch some tissues being ossified. Uh, so what we're going to do is basically understand how our tissues, other tissues, can become bone. So throughout life, your bones, most bones begin as cartilage, they're going to have to increase their size. They're going to have to increase their shape. They have to increase their strength. They're going to change. They're going to go through a process called remodeling, basically. Now, ossification or osteogenesis is bone formation. So what we're going to do is this involves calcification. This involves depositing calcium salts, depositing the calcium in the bone and other tissues, like, for example, cartilage. We can deposit calcium stuff occurs in other tissues other than bone, like a cartilage, for example. Now, this can be two kinds of ossification. This is endochondral and intramembranous. Endochondral occurs in hyaline cartilage, and this replaces existing cartilage with bone. And intramembranous. Now, this is going to occur in the dermis, which is part of the cutaneous membrane. So, intramembranous, the membranous being cutaneous membrane. Bone replaces fibrous connective tissues. This is how things like a clavicle and mandible get made. Okay, so as we talk about that, we'll talk about these. Now, we're going to begin with endochondral ossification. Now, this process is a complex process that takes 7 steps to happen, and it begins as hyaline cartilage, and bone starts to replace it. Now, basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a cartilage model, and we're going to slowly make it. Now, what I do try to do when I'm in a classroom is try to draw this, but I only have a little board, so I'm going to draw something else later, but what we're going to do is start looking at pictures when we do this. And the first thing we really want to do is basically think your cartilage is going to get bigger. The chondrocytes, they're going to die as they basically starve to death, and they'll leave behind big holes in the cartilage. So what's going to happen right here is these chondrocytes near the center, they'll get bigger and they'll basically degenerate and die, okay? They'll begin to die and leave behind big holes, okay? That's basically what's going to happen right here is larger chondrocytes in the matrix, okay? Now, blood vessels next are going to grow around the edges, and when they grow around the edges, they're going to be bringing calcium and other things like that with them, and they're going to bring hormones, and the bone cells that are around the perichondrium, which is the membrane of cartilage, that's going to get converted to an osteoblast, and that's going to encase the shaft of bone in some bone tissue. So we're going to encase this shaft. So this blood vessel grows nearby. And what's going to happen, this is going to bring hormones and bring calcium, and we're going to start to encase the shaft in bone tissue. We're going to make a so-called here, they call it a bone collar, okay? All right. Now, next what we're going to do is we are going to take those blood vessels and we're going to penetrate the cartilage, and the osteoblasts are going to be turned in to make spongy bone. And that's going to be called the primary ossification center. Bone formation will spread to the end of the bones, and that's what's going to happen next. So here we could see the blood vessel penetrates. Blood vessel penetrates the shaft. It goes in, and we form a primary ossification center. Okay. And that's going to start to make spongy bone of our medullary cavity. Remodeling happens, and it's going to create a medullary cavity that's going to make the shaft get thicker and the bone increase length and diameter. Okay, that's what's going to happen next. So what we can see is now our medullary cavity forms right here. We have a medullary cavity. The shaft gets thicker and stronger, and it moves towards the ends. So we can see it moving towards the ends as blood vessels penetrate that bone. Now, blood vessels near the epiphysis will penetrate, and there will be a secondary ossification center. And the secondary ossification center, that's going to be the step 5. So let's take a look at step 5. Step 5, blood vessels penetrate the secondary ossification center here. Here we have a secondary ossification center. Here they call it the secondary ossification center. Blood vessels penetrate that, and we form it, okay? That's going to happen next. Then the epiphysis will get filled with spongy bone, and the metaphysis becomes what's called an epiphyseal cartilages, or the growth plates, and they will grow until puberty. Okay, so right here we have the epiphyseal cartilage, the growth plate growing until puberty. You have the growth zone. There's growth zones inside here. There's different zones that actually allow for growth. And the cells divide. This creates a longer bone. This is what happens when you grow. This is why you have growing pains. Okay. Then at puberty, the epiphyseal cartilages close. We call these the epiphyseal plates, and they close, and they eventually become what's called epiphyseal lines. We saw this when we saw the anatomical neck of the humerus. Okay, so there's an epiphyseal line, and that closes after puberty. Okay, all right. Okay. So that's how that's going to happen, step by step. Now, I do ask a question on this. I don't ask anything too crazy about it, but I do ask something about this, okay? Now, what I want to do is talk about intramembranous ossification. This is dermal ossification. It occurs in the dermis. This makes your dermal bones like your mandible and your clavicles, the lower jaw and your collarbones. There are 5 steps that I do show. Basically, these islands of mesenchyme and bone matrix, mesenchyme will have islands of bone tissue that form. They will grow and fuse together into a mass called dermal ossification. So that's going to make your skull, that's going to make the jaw, going to make the clavicle and things like that, okay? So here you can actually see your growth plates, and they close up and become the epiphyseal lines for the adult. So epiphyseal cartilages, the growth plates, will be seen in a child. Here we can see most of the carpal bones haven't formed yet, and here we can see the carpal bones are formed. All right. Now, there is another kind of growth called apositional bone growth. Apositional bone growth is thickening. This is when we add layers of circumferential lamellae called apositional bone growth. Now, when the primary ossification centers form, we had an artery and vein an artery that penetrated that. That is what becomes the nutrient arteries and veins. That is when the blood vessels, they result from the blood vessels that form the primary ossification centers. Then there's metaphyseal arteries and veins. Those were formed when blood vessels penetrated to form the secondary ossification centers. Then there's the blood vessels of the periosteum called periosteal vessels. These are blood vessels that supply the most superficial bone cells, and they're just blood vessels of the periosteum. All right, now we're going to really get into some physiology where I definitely hit this, and there will be a lot of understanding that I want done here. And this is the calcium homeostasis. Basically, I want you guys to think about bone as a bank for calcium. So basically, here's kind of how I want you to think about this. Okay, so let's say we got bone right here. And we got blood right here. Okay. Blood and bone. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is use hormones to move stuff from these, okay? Now, what we're going to do, if I want to raise blood calcium and want to lower blood calcium, if I want to get from blood, I can take bone calcium from the bones and put it into the blood. We need a hormone called parathyroid hormone. If we want to do the opposite, we need calcitonin CT. Okay? And that's these 2 hormones that we really need to focus on right here, okay, physiologically. Okay, these 2 hormones are going to be doing all the things that we need to do, and this right here gives us this gives us the big picture. This gives us the big picture of the science that we're going to learn. Okay, so what I want to do is to look at this a little bit more in detail. Okay, so what we have, guys, is to look at this is to understand that calcium is stored in the bone. It's like a bank. Now, calcium is very important for like muscle cells, heart, nerve, things like that, membranes for signaling. It's a very important ion. So calcium ions, being so important, are highly regulated by hormones because it's so important that we keep it under control. The two hormones that regulate calcium is calcitonin. Calcitonin is released when calcium is high, and it lowers calcium through negative feedback. And parathyroid hormone is released when calcium is low, and it raises blood calcium through negative feedback. Okay, these are both negative feedback hormones. Okay, now what we want to see is how, let's kind of get an idea. If we looked at bone, we would see it's a calcium bank. It's 39% calcium is what bone is. So the inorganic components that make it up, 39% of that is calcium. Okay, 67% is inorganic component, and then organic was mostly collagen. Now, calcium is 99% of the total amount of calcium is in bone. 99% of your calcium is in bone. And then another 88% is phosphate. And then carbonate is another bit. But there is quite a lot of calcium. So calcium and phosphate are the two most abundant things, but calcium is the really big one, okay? That's one we really want to worry about. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about it, and then we'll kind of, and I'll go through here and kind of explain it physiologically first, and then I'll look at the notes. Sorry, let me make that a little bit neater. About to drop it. Can't hold on to anything. Okay. Okay, and let's draw a line right there. Now, what we're going to do over here, we're going to draw a gland. Two glands, actually. One is our thyroid, and the other one's the parathyroid. Okay, these two glands. Now, these are the two glands that are going to release the hormones. Now, over here, what we got to do is draw out some of the cells that we're going to be affecting. Okay, we're going to be affecting a cell called an osteoblast. We're going to be affecting a cell called an osteoclast. We're going to be affecting kidney. I never can draw. I never can fit all this in here. That's the thing about using this little board. I can do it really nice in my in the classroom. All right. That's supposed to be like an intestine there. This didn't draw it very well. Okay, like intestines, GI tract. Okay, we're going to do the same thing here. Okay. Okay. Now, what we're going to see is what these things do. Okay. Now, let's basically start off. If we had high calcium, high Ca++, high calcium in the blood. Okay, blood has high calcium. What's going to happen is when we have high calcium, we need to lower it. Now, what lowers it? Calcitonin. So we're going to come from the thyroid. We're going to release calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to come in and it's going to ride to these tissues and it's going to start to affect these tissues in many ways, okay? Now, what we're going to do is when we come to the osteoblast, we're going to take those guys and we're going to stimulate them. So that's going to make them start to take bone calcium out of blood and put it into bone, okay? Osteoclasts are going to get inhibited, so they're going to stop releasing calcium into the blood. The kidneys are going to increase excretion. We're going to increase excretion, okay? And GI tract is going to decrease absorption, okay? That's what we're going to do. Now, all right. Now, what we're going to do is this is ultimately going to lower calcium, okay? All right. So, all right. Now, what we're going to do next is let's say that we had a low calcium, not enough calcium in the blood, okay? Here's where we're going to need our parathyroid gland to release the hormone PTH, parathyroid hormone. Okay, this is going to come out and go to all these tissues. Osteoblasts, they're actually going to be inhibited, but we're going to turn on the osteoclasts, and they're going to release calcium into the blood and start to raise calcium. Kidneys are going to decrease excretion, and gut is going to increase absorption. So what we're going to do is raise the calcium. Okay? Now, something you should pay attention to. Kidneys and GI tract should respond opposite, and osteoblasts and osteoclasts should respond opposite. These should respond opposite. These should respond opposite. Okay? All right. So we drew it out and talked about it. Go ahead and pause if you want to finish your drawing. Okay. Let's go back to our notes. So what we're going to see is parathyroid hormones produced by cells called chief cells in the parathyroid gland. They increase calcium ion levels. They stimulate osteoclast activity. They inhibit osteoblast activity. They decrease calcium excretion in kidneys, and they increase intestinal absorption along with calcitriol. So that is the parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is secreted by C cells, sometimes called parafollicular cells. They decrease calcium ion levels by inhibiting osteoclast, stimulating osteoblasts, increasing calcium excretion in kidneys, and decreasing intestinal absorption of calcium. So basically, the big thing you want to do is be able to draw this right here out. If you can do this, you get it. You'll get these pretty quickly if you can do this little sketch. Okay. All right. Now. There's some things that they talk about that is not true that osteoblast activity is unaffected. That is not true. They say that in the notes, but it is not true. I am teaching you the most accurate physiology about what's happening there. Okay, now types of bone fractures. Fractures, there is damage to bone. That is a fracture. Okay. And how we can classify it is position of the end of bone after a fracture, how complete it is, and if the bone breaks through the skin. So position end after fracture. You have what's called a non-displaced fracture. The ends of the bone are in its natural position. Displaced fracture, the bone ends are out of alignment. Complete fractures or incomplete fractures. How complete the fracture is. Complete fracture, bone is completely broken. Incomplete fracture, the bone is partially broken. If it breaks through the skin, a compound fracture breaks through the skin, a simple fracture does not. Okay, you could be a mixture of all of these. You could be a mixture, well, of three of these. You can be have three of these different things in there. So we have different kinds of fractures. And here's some different types of fractures as well that exist, just kinds of fractures. I do want to talk about bone repair. I don't really have any good questions that I've ever asked on an exam on bone repair. It fractures, then we have to heal it. Okay. Now, when we fracture it, we form a hematoma. There's going to be a large blood clot. We're going to have a fibrous network. We're going to have bone cells in the area die because the blood vessels have been damaged because there's a hematoma. There's a callus formation. The cells in the endosteum and periosteum will divide and migrate to the fracture zone. They will create a callus, stabilize the break, an internal callus in the medullary cavity, and an external callus around the bone. Then spongy bone will form, osteoblasts will replace the central cartilage of the external callus with spongy bone, and then we'll start to have compact bone formation, where repaired bone will be slightly thicker and stronger than normal because it has been broken before. All right. And that's what's going to happen, and you'll have a callus, okay? Now, diseases won't be on there. FOP, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. That's when bone forms around skeletal muscle. We're not going to have that on the test. Gigantism is overproduction of growth hormones before puberty, so you're really big. Marfan's, that's an increase in cartilage production, and epiphyseal cartilage causes long bones. This is an endocrine disorder and things like that. Rickets, caused by vitamin D3 deficiency, weak bones. Osteopenia, inadequate ossification. Osteoporosis, bone mass is reduced. Osteogenesis imperfecta is brittle bone disease. We have lack of collagen, especially type 3 collagen. FOP, with FOP, this is a really advanced FOP skeleton, pretty nasty looking disease. Marfan's and gigantism. This guy was over 8 feet tall, about 8 feet tall, or around 8 feet, a little over 8 feet. I forget his name, but he was the tallest man in the world, and he had gigantism. And this is a Marfan's, very long fingers, very skinny, things like that. Long fingers, elongated, but this is a child with Marfan's. Osteoporosis, the spongy bone in osteoporosis will get porous and very brittle. Hunched over will be seen. That kind of characteristic hump is seen in osteoporosis patients. Osteomyelitis is a disease that won't be on there, but it's bone infection. Osteomyelitis infections of bone. They can reach the bone by traveling through the bloodstream. They travel basically through the Volkmann's canals. One of the ways they can spread throughout the bone. Infections can begin in the bone itself after injury. Bone gets exposed to germs. Usually bone is a sterile tissue, so you will see normal signs and symptoms of infection, including fever, swelling, warmth and redness, pain in the area, and fatigue. The normal signs and symptoms of infection. Okay. All right, that concludes our lecture. So we finished the chapter. There we go. We'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much.